So it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Bungard. He's a professor of computer science and he runs the Morphology, Evolution, and Cognition Lab at the University of Vermont. His work involves a lot of what he's going to talk about. I think the increasingly automated design and manufacture of soft robots, evolved robots, and crowdsourced robots, as well as computer designed living organisms. And so we'll be hearing a lot about that today. Josh has been the recipient of a number of awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the Innovators Over Under 35, and the Microsoft New Faculty Fellow Award. And he's the author of a book that we use a lot in a lot of our cognitive science courses, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. So without further ado, Josh Bungard.
Great. Thank you so much, Eduardo, and thanks to all of you for coming. Obviously, these are unprecedented times, so I doubly appreciate your time, and hopefully there will be some food for thought in here for everyone. So I thought what I would do today is try and give two mini talks rather than one in-depth talk. I know the CogSci program at IU very well by reputation. I also know many of you quite well. So I know the interests are very diverse, but generally crowd around this concept of embodied cognition. So I thought I would pick two very different projects from my lab and show how they have this common anchoring in embodied cognition. Okay, before I talk about NLP and computer designed organisms, though, I wanted to start with sort of laying the groundwork of where I see my work in embodied cognition fitting in, and also a lot of the work that you all are all involved in. And I'm going to use a geometric metaphor to talk about sort of the state of play at the moment in AI and robotics. So if we want to train an agent to perform some task, the first thing we usually do is generate some kind of loss function and try and calculate some numerical score for how well the agent is doing at the current task. For the moment, an agent could be a robot, a neural network, a computer-designed organism, could be anything. If you imagine each point in this performance dimension, a point embedded in the space, the further the point is to the right, it represents an agent that's doing better at whatever the loss function is, and points further to the left are agents that are doing no better than chance. You can then think about a machine learning algorithm as a line segment embedded in this one dimension. And obviously for years and years and years, we were kind of stuck. And the big data and the big compute revolution and the work on convolutional neural networks kind of broke through a barrier. And for many tasks, we can now train neural networks to do certain tasks better than human experts. We can add a second dimension, which is we can ask not just how performant a given agent is at a given task, but how general it is. How many different tasks can that agent perform? Eduardo and I were talking earlier this afternoon about multifunctionality. Clearly, this is an open problem in machine learning at the moment, and we're not doing so well on that. This is an interesting unsolved problem. Do we start by training a very good specialist? Meaning we sort of start to the bottom right in these two dimensions and then gradually train it to become increasingly general. If you do that, you quickly come up against the problem of catastrophic forgetting. The agent will typically learn the new task you're posing to it at the same speed that it will forget old tasks. So there's a second unsolved problem. How do you deal with catastrophic interference? The other option is to start sort of top left, expose an agent early on to most or all of the tasks you'd like it to perform, and then create a training algorithm that moves points from left to right in this two-dimensional space. So you can imagine a whole bunch of different trajectories through this two-dimensional space which embody machine learning algorithms, and those algorithms in turn embody certain inductive biases or certain ways of thinking about which is the right way to move through this space to produce increasingly performant and increasingly general agents. Sorry, I forgot to mention at the beginning, I would love this presentation to be interactive. If you have any questions, just type them into chat, and Eduardo or the other co-host will shout them out, or unmute yourself. I know many of you are all friends here, so happy for this to be interactive. I will stop myself at 5 p.m., I promise. I know people have a lot of work-life challenges these days, so I won't take it personal if you leave. I probably won't notice that you leave. So there you go. Okay. So, all right. A lot of people in machine learning, whether they admit it or not, believe that with just more compute and more data, we will just push these agents to become increasingly performant and increasingly general. Some people believe in AGI, some don't. Most of the people on this call, I would expect, believe that we need to some degree to consider this third dimension, which is embodiment. Many of the people that are on this call, many of the faculty at IU are pioneers in the study of embodied cognition. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but just to round out this story, embodiment means a lot of different things to different people. I am not going to attempt to define embodiment, especially not with this crowd. It means different things to different people. For our purposes today, we're going to mostly talk about robots, and robots that are more embodied are more complex morphologically. They have more motors, more sensors. They're made out of exotic materials. When we get to Xenobots, they'll be machines that are built out of living tissues. Robots with little or simple embodiment, like the Roomba, has just a couple motors, a couple sensors. Non-embodied agents like naked neural networks don't have the ability to use a body to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. So if we add this third dimension, we can now imagine any point in this three-dimensional space where the distance of the point towards the back face of this cube represents an agent that is more embodied than a corresponding point that is closer to the front face of this cube. So like Carl Sims before me and many other researchers now, I'm interested in creating algorithms that lie somewhere along this grand diagonal. So during the training process, the training process is searching over or optimizing populations of agents. In some cases, those agents' morphology is becoming more complex. So evolution is adding motors and sensors, or altering the action and state spaces of each individual agent during the training process. Hopefully these agents are moving from left to right. They're getting better at whatever we ask them to do. And in some cases, these points are also increasing in height. We are gradually exposing these morphologically complexifying agents to more and more tasks. I don't know whether a straight a straight shot towards AGI is the right way to go, but again, you can imagine a whole bunch of loops and curls and different ways of moving through this space. And I think there is a huge amount of work to be done about asking not just whether embodiment is important to creating generally intelligent agents, but which path to take. How should we, or an evolutionary process or a developmental process, how should we gradually complexify these agents as they are being challenged to perform an increasing number of tasks? So in most of the work in my group, we are not just considering an agent with a fixed embodiment or a fixed morphology, we are also trying to alter the morphology itself. And I'll talk about the influence of morphological change in both projects that I'm going to talk about today. Morphological change in Xenobots and morphological change in agents that are grappling with NLP. Okay, before I talk about that, however, I would like to do some shameless advertising. So with three of my colleagues, Mike Levin at Tufts, a biologist, Melanie Moses, a roboticist at UNM, and Nick Cheney, a machine learning researcher at UVM, we were very fortunate to receive a NARI grant from NSF. NARI stands for National AI Research Institute. We received just this month a planning grant, which means we have 2 years to bring together a much larger group of researchers beyond just the 4 of us, and submit in a little over a year's time an institute proposal. That institute proposal would lead to the formation of what we've sort of tongue-in-cheek named the Proteus Institute. For those of you that know your mythology, Proteus was the Greek god of sea change or constant change. He or she, depending on the situation, would adopt many different forms. And the reason we chose Proteus is to try and highlight a distinction between protean systems, which we're going to use to refer to organisms that are evolving and humans that are developing. Any living system is constantly changing at spatial scales, temporal scales, different modalities, learning competencies, social competencies, continuous change. Most robots and machines change little, if at all. So most state-of-the-art neural networks, they may change their synaptic weights, but they don't change their architectures. Architecture search is an open problem in ML. Most robots maintain a fixed embodiment. They don't change it. So how do we capture at a large scale some of the general properties or some of the general opportunities that continuous change provide to organisms, and incorporate that continuous change into embodied machines like robots and non-embodied machines like neural networks? There's more details about what at the moment is a Proteus initiative. We haven't reached the institute phase yet. As I mentioned, we're planning for this, and in submitting the planning grant, I promised that we would pull in 22 of our additional colleagues, 4 of whom I think are on the call today. So again, I'm here to talk about Xenobots and NLP, but also I am here to recruit people interested in how organisms and humans change and how we can distill that into some general properties that we could build into robots and neural networks. Faculty, I've already tried to recruit you. Grad students that are on the call, if you're interested, please shoot me an email, and I'd love to tell you more about what we have in mind. Okay, so again, like many of the groups here, I work on lots of different things, but a common theme that pulls them all together is the issue of embodiment. For many people, they implicitly view the body as an impediment to learning, that we can sort of discard the body and focus purely on neural mechanisms. But for those working in embodied cognition, for decades, we have tried to argue that the body is not an impediment, but it is an enabler for cognition. And obviously that means many different things to different people. In previous work together with Hod Lipson then at Cornell, we showed how embodiment can allow a machine to recover function after it's been grievously damaged. Most autonomous machines, once they're broken, they stay broken. They don't fix themselves. That was something we worked on that I'm not going to talk about today. We're continuing on that work on damage recovery in soft robots together with Rebecca Kramer-Botiglio. She's a very gifted roboticist who runs the Fabratory at Yale University. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on CDOs and language. So I'll start with computer-designed organisms. This is a funded collaboration with myself and my PhD student Sam Kriegman and his trusty sidekick Luna there, and our 2 biology colleagues at Tufts, Doug Blackiston and Mike Levin. We published this work back in PNAS, and we got our 15 minutes of fame with a lot of media attention for this project. When you build robots out of frog cells, you can expect a lot of media attention. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about sort of the technical details under Xenobots today. There's a Xenobot. It's 1 millimeter across, so not very large, just to give you a sense of scale. Okay, so where does Xenobots fit into synthetic biology? Synthetic biology's been around for a while. It's already fielded some amazing machines. This is some work by a group at Harvard who back in 2016 built a biohybrid. So this is a robot that's made up of artificial and biological materials. You can see there's a latex or rubber, see-through rubber substrate. There's some gold plating on top, and then they grew rat heart muscle tissue on this surface. They genetically engineered that heart muscle tissue to react to light, and it's basically a Bratenberg. So if you flash bright light front left of this organism, it will turn to the left. It will phototack towards the light, and an incredibly amazing machine in and of its own right, an engineering achievement. There are more biohybrids that are out there now at the moment, but all of these biohybrids, the design, the embodiment of these was determined by a human engineer, a human biologist in this case. There are also a growing number of organoids. So organoids are basically organs that are grown on a chip. The way in which they are grown on the chip is, again, something that has been decided on by a human engineer or a team of engineers and biologists. The Xenobots, in contrast, are computer designed. We're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to search the space of all possible Xenobot designs and then try and build the best evolved designs. So in building up sort of this ontology, we're going to distinguish between computer designed, in this case, organisms, and human designed organisms or biohybrids. Organisms is already a controversial term. There's lots of controversial terms in there. You may not agree with me that a Xenobot is an organism. You may not agree with me that a Xenobot is a robot. I personally don't think they're either. There's something in between, but we can maybe discuss that at the end. The reason we call these organisms and not organoids is that they're self-motile. So the Xenobots that I'm going to show you in a moment, which are made up of completely biological tissue, no hybrids, no artificial material. They're able to move themselves from point A to point B. So in that sense, they're more like a robot. They only have certain cell types. They do not have a digestive system. They do not have a neural system. They do not have a reproductive system. So they don't have the full set of functions that a typical organism has, but there you go. If we want to get a computer to design a new type of organism for us, what should that design space look like? What are the different ways in which an AI or an evolutionary algorithm can put together the morphology of a new type of organism? We focused in our PNAS paper on reconfigurable organisms, which builds on the observation that you can rearrange tissue in certain species, and those tissues will not return to their original configuration. Under certain conditions, they will set into that rearranged morphology, maintain that morphology, and if it's the right morphology, that computer designed organism will do something useful. It will match what we wanted it to do. There are other ways that we could imagine building computer designed organisms aside from just rearranging their tissues or reconfiguring their tissues. I'm not going to talk about that, but again, happy to field questions about that later. Okay, so I want to talk, for the computer scientists, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the underlying algorithm, and I'm going to use some pseudocode which will look complicated, but it's basically an evolutionary algorithm. Before we get to the evolutionary algorithm, however, I want to talk about the outermost loop of this algorithm, which at least in computer speak here on line 2 will run forever. What this algorithm alternatively is doing is training an agent, which in our case is going to be designing a simulated organism in a physics engine, crossing the sim to real gap, so manufacturing a version of one of those computer generated designs, deploying the agent and then either recovering it from the field or observing its behavior in situ, so putting the computer designed organism in a petri dish and watching what it does, comparing its action in reality against its action in the physics engine. So this is the idea of sim to real. It's another open problem in evolutionary robotics that's been known since evolutionary robotics began in the early 1990s. What I'm going to focus on today, however, is not sim to real, but real to sim. If a computer designed organism fails to exhibit in reality what it exhibited in a physics engine, can we infer what went wrong and build something back into the simulator, which I'm just going to represent with the thetas here for a moment. We won't worry about what the thetas are. We're going to modify some aspect of how we model these things and repeat this loop. Allow an evolutionary algorithm to retrain one or more computer designed organisms in this improved simulator, deploy one or more of them to reality, and hopefully close the sim to real gap. There's been a lot of work on sim to real. There has been very little work on real to sim. If you failed, or if you partially fail to deploy something to reality, how can we systematize what we learn from reality and fold that back into the simulator? Okay, so that's the outer loop. We're going to alternate between sim to real, and hopefully in this outer loop we will converge or narrow the sim to real gap. The computer, the AI, is getting better and better at figuring out how to design, in this case, computer-designed organisms. There is this middle loop in the middle for each time we're designing a set of agents. This is algorithm 1.1, which, if you can read pseudocode, you'll recognize very quickly as an evolutionary algorithm. On line 1, we generate a population of random body plans. Step 2, we're going to iterate over a number of generations, and during each generation, we're going to evaluate each of the bodies. And bodies that have low reward are going to be deleted, and those that survive, we're going to make randomly modified copies of those bodies to replace the ones we killed off. During the copying process, we mutate the body of the agents, which, for those that know reinforcement learning, also alters the state and action space for the newly created robot. Okay. No evolutionary robotics presentation would be complete without some cool videos. So this is actually from Nick Cheney and Jeff Clune and Hod Lipson's first attempt to evolve populations of soft robots in simulation. So you can sort of see the best robot in the population at each generation in the top panel, and in the bottom panel you can see the fitness curve. So the fitness of the best individual in the population at that point in evolutionary time, where evolutionary time is on the horizontal axis in the bottom panel, and the top panel is, you can see behavior. You'll notice that this particular evolutionary algorithm is modifying the 3D shapes of these soft robots, and the colored voxels, or the 3D pixels, the different color represents different material properties of these robots. So in essence, what we tell the evolutionary algorithm is that it can build robots in a physics engine out of Lego bricks. There's red, green, light blue, and dark blue Lego bricks, and these Lego bricks have different properties. In this case, the red and green voxels are meant to represent actuated voxels. So the red and green voxels increase and decrease at a fixed frequency. Red voxels increase and decrease their volume in antiphase to the green ones. So this is kind of like agonist and antagonistic muscle groups, if you like. You'll notice that evolution very quickly converges on basically balls of muscle. It uses all red and all green and gets rid of the passive light blue and dark blue voxels. So aside from the physics engine, there isn't much that's new here in terms of evolutionary algorithms. Going all the way back to Carl Sims in the 1990s, we're evolving populations of virtual creatures in a physics engine. Okay. So we basically took that work by Lipson's group on evolving populations of soft robots. We adopted their soft robot simulator and basically reran this process. And in this case, unbeknownst to the evolutionary algorithm, it's producing robots that are going to be built from frog cells rather than out of the components of a soft robot. In this case, we ran our evolutionary algorithm 100 times, and we took the most fit individual out of each of those 100 runs, which gave us these 100 robots. You'll notice they're all built from red voxels. The fitness function was simply the speed of movement, and not surprisingly, as always, convergent evolution, the best solution is to be a ball of muscle, and the particular 3D shape of that ball of muscle doesn't matter too much. So that's the end of step 3 in this outermost loop. We have 100 candidates that we would like to send to reality. Turns out that none of those candidates could be turned into physical Xenobots. The way we determined that was actually pretty simple. So Doug Blackiston is the microsurgeon at Tufts who actually builds these Xenobots. And basically we showed him all these 100 designs and he went through and said, no, 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 100 times. So we failed to cross the reality gap. We went back and said, how come? And he basically eventually came up with these 3 reasons. They're sort of 3 filters, and they're specific to the way in which he can or cannot build things frog cell by frog cell. So very specific to this substrate, not very complicated, but basically we ruled everything out. But in the process of this basic email exchange back and forth with Doug Blackiston, which was this failed attempt to cross the reality gap, we distilled out of that conversation in a very ad hoc way the biggest stumbling block, which was actually the way that we were modeling the red voxels. We were being overly optimistic in the red voxels, which in the Xenobots are going to be built from frog heart muscle tissue. Turns out that if you take frog heart muscle tissue and put it together in the shape of a frog heart, that's what the tissue expects. It will wire up more or less, and they will all of the tissue will beat synchronously, meaning the volume of the heart will increase and decrease and act like a pump, which is exactly what you want. If you rearrange heart muscle tissue, the individual pieces of the tissue will still spontaneously pulse, but they will not synchronize. They will do something else. And what that something else is at the moment hard to articulate. So we went back in and we modified our simulator so that now whenever the computer includes a red Lego brick in one of its designs, that red Lego brick is going to pulse at a given frequency, but it's going to pulse at a random phase offset from the other red Lego bricks in that design. So you can sort of see that in this video here. Here's one of the initial random simulated Xenobots in this second round, or this second attempt to cross the sim to real gap. You'll notice, not surprisingly, that this design doesn't go anywhere. Here's another random design, in which case the evolutionary algorithm built only from red voxels. It also jiggles a lot, but doesn't displace. And a third random design. The light blue voxels that you see, this is heart epithelial tissue, so passive soft skin, basically. So not surprisingly, you have a needle in the haystack problem here. The vast number of random designs don't displace, they don't move at all from the origin, which is what we want them to do. But if you watch these 3 videos very carefully, you'll notice that this third one moves, very, very small distance away from the origin. So this is an extremely difficult design decision. You're basically asking the computer to design a machine out of parts, where one of the most important features of the parts, which is their phase offset, is random. Or it may not be random, but we made this conservative assumption in this process. It's like if you were asked to design a boat, and you can put as many human rowers in the boat as you want. The rowers will all row at the same frequency, but they will not synchronize. They will row at their own random phase offset. For most people, it's very hard to imagine what the 3D shape of that boat should be so that the boat goes straight as quickly as possible. It seems to most human engineers an almost impossible task, which is exactly the kind of design task you want to turn over to an evolutionary algorithm. So in the second round, in the first round, it produced these 100 champions from 100 evolutionary runs. Now with this more realistic assumption about the biology of these things, it came up with this design. In this case, you'll see that it doesn't always converge on a ball of muscle. Now it seems to be quote unquote, using epithelial tissue, so soft, passive material. There's a question here from Donsik Lee. Does a heart cell expand and contract at a constant interval? We assume so in this case, and at least in the Xenobots, it's more or less constant. Like in biology, always it's not quite, but it was a good enough assumption to make in this case. And we basically, again, determined that kind of ad hoc just by observing some random attempts to build by Doug Blackiston to build some of these things. So we're closing this gap by feeding stuff back from real into sim, but it's ad hoc. It's an open problem about how to do this in a systematic way. Okay. So just to show you actually how Doug actually goes about building these, what you see in the bottom left is a Xenobot Sculpture. This is only built from epithelial tissue, so no myocardial, no heart muscle tissue at all. Basically what Doug does is to take an early frog embryo in blastula stage, pulls off a bunch of stem cells that float independently in pond water, basically. But they will spontaneously, if they're close enough together, they will re-aggregate. They will try and reform into a sphere of spheres, into a blastula. While they are trying to do that, Doug will go in with his microforceps here and a cauterization tool, which will burn away some of the stem cells, which in this case are fated to become epithelial or skin tissue. So you can see him kind of sculpting this simple quadrupedal form. So this is him building a sculpture. When he does this with the heart muscle tissue, he will do this like a sandwich. He will layer down 2D strips of skin and heart muscle tissue, depending on the 3D design. And while he's doing this layering, he will then also scrape away the tissue. So some of these are buildable with this combined layering and subtractive process. Some of these designs are not buildable in that way. Again, it's all dependent on the manufacturing process. Okay, it turns out that 5 of these designs were actually buildable, and this design in particular turned out to be the one that worked best. So you'll see the computer prediction in the top, and in the bottom you're looking at this constructed Xenobot basically from above. You'll notice they clearly don't have the same 3D shape. There are important differences. There are important differences between the shape, but it more or less moves in the way that the simulated Xenobot does. Not a perfect match, but definitely far from chance. How do we know that this is far from chance? We took the physical Xenobot, which you see moving here, and we flipped it on its back. And when we flipped it on its back, you'll see in a moment that it doesn't move. So that tells us that the 3D shape and the distribution of tissues matters, and the orientation of the body. So if we manipulate the phenotype in just a simple manner, which is to flip it on its back, you lose this sim to real transfer. We tested this systematically. There was a question here: can you introduce a microelectronic stimulator into the system so that you could produce a coordinated wave of expansion? Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I believe yes, we could do that. We've been trying to focus for the moment on purely biological constructs, but you definitely could probably create a biohybrid in which you could facilitate or rescue coordinated dynamics. How to do that would be interesting, but I think that's a great question. What was interesting here from a computational point of view is if we don't do that, we make these very conservative assumptions. Could we cross the gap at all? And the fact that we could was kind of exciting. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving, but we could show statistically, in a statistically significant way, that at least for this design with multiple deployments, it could cross the sim to real gap. Okay. So once we'd done the hard part about the sim to real gap, we thought we'd have some fun, and Doug built multiple instances of the same design. And you can see what the computer predicted in the physics engine would happen, and what happens when Doug built multiple instances of this design and put them together in a petri dish. In the top image, we were interested in, would they do things like creating piles? Could we do some sort of simple collective behavior tasks that you see in swarm robotics? And one of the interesting things that you see here is just given the 3D shape and the fact that they're kind of soft, even in the simulator, they will kind of spontaneously lock together and do this kind of do-si-do dance. And you see the same thing in the physical Xenobots. Whether that's just happening by chance, it's hard to say. But in the physical Xenobots, they tend to exhibit additional behaviors beyond what they were evolved to do in simulation. And that's kind of interesting. So in robotics, you're typically dealing with dumb metal and ceramic and electronics, and the robot will usually do less than what you want it to do. For better or for worse, when you're dealing with robots built from living tissue, they often do more than they were evolved to do. It seems there's some evidence that these Xenobots are actually sensing one another and reacting. And again, as I mentioned, we didn't actually build any sense organs into these systems, but of course, these machines are built from frog cells, and cells themselves have very sophisticated sensory and motor apparatuses. So again, they may be spontaneously organizing their behavior, even though they weren't evolved to do so. An interesting direction that we're pursuing at the moment. One other thing I wanted to throw out here is in the supplemental materials of PNAS, we compared an evolutionary algorithm against a state-of-the-art stochastic gradient descent method and the same stochastic gradient descent method with restarts, because one of the reviewers asked us to do so, but it was a good thing that they asked us to do it. It was worthwhile. We started with small Xenobots that could only be at most 2 by 2 by 2 in size, and each of those 8 voxels can either be absent, present as a red voxel, heart muscle tissue, or present as a light blue voxel, meaning skin tissue. That gives you 3 to the 8 possible designs, or over 6,000 designs. We tested each of those 6,000 designs in simulation, and we know what the optimal solution is. One of those 6,000 is the best. The evolutionary algorithm we use typically would find that best solution within about 2,000 or 4,000 evaluations in a simulator. Stochastic gradient descent did about the same. When we went to a slightly larger space, which allowed for 3 by 2 by 2 Xenobots, meaning there's a total of 500,000 possible Xenobots, we could still enumerate all of those on our supercomputer. And now already you can see that the evolutionary algorithm is doing a better job over multiple runs of finding the best one among those 500,000 designs. And we got as far as 3 by 3 by 2, and we couldn't enumerate the entire space beyond that. But you can see that already the EA is doing better than a state-of-the-art stochastic gradient descent. Why? The main reason is that the set of parameters that are being optimized are integers. 0, the voxel is absent. 1, the voxel is going to become heart muscle tissue. 2, the voxel is going to become skin tissue. Most stochastic gradient descent methods that we know of don't do well about navigating integer-based parameter vectors. And as you can imagine, it's not very differentiable. When you're dealing with morphologies, making a slight change to the morphology can have a drastic impact on behavior. That's not the case when you're at small scales, but it is when you're at large scales. So I think there's lots of interesting work that could be done here about trying to demonstrate back to the RL community that there are benefits to an evolutionary algorithm, and probably added benefits of combining RL and evolutionary algorithms. There's no actual policy optimization here because the Xenobots don't have any neural tissue. There is no brain. The behavior arises purely from the body. And as someone who's interested in embodied cognition, you gotta love that, right? Okay. So I've got 15 minutes left. I'm going to switch now and talk about something completely different, which is language. My lab is definitely not an NLP lab. We are novices in this space. Most of this work was carried out by my undergraduate, David Matthews, who, as you can see, is very camera shy. All of the brilliant ideas in here are all David's, and all the naivety about NLP is all mine. Okay. So, language, let's start with Eliza. Of course, Eliza was a fantastic example of NLP. She was a brilliant psychotherapist from the 1970s who's now been replaced with GPT-3. And of course, as an AI person, I love to make fun of GPT-3. Here's some of my favorite examples of GPT-3 failing. Of course, GPT is a fantastic system. There's a lot of advances in NLP here. But like Eliza and every other chatbot that came before it, it has these telling weaknesses. As someone who's interested in embodiment, I of course know where the weaknesses are coming from. It's because neither Eliza nor GPT-3 is embodied. Again, I'm preaching to the choir, but there's been some amazing work in the last decade finding these connections between the brain, the body, and language. I won't go into Pulvermüller's work here, but there's a lot of work that says there is this connection and that the body may be supportive in learning language. And this idea of language grounding or symbol grounding in robotics has been around for a long time. So what David and I asked was, could we leverage the grounding of language in machines by leveraging modern word embeddings? So first of all, I probably don't have to introduce this Bratenberg here, but just as a reminder, this Bratenberg has 2 light sensors on the front, 2 wheels on the back, and ipsilateral connections. Left sensor attached to left motor, right sensor attached to right motor, which means this machine is photophobic. If more light falls on the right-hand photosensor, the right wheel will turn faster than left wheel and it will run away from light. Okay. So how do we connect robotics with a word embedding? Well, again, most of you probably know word embeddings better than we do, but one of the amazing things about word embeddings is you take a natural language word, like an English word like walk, you push it through a neural network and it will spit out an embedding or a vector. In this cartoon example here, imagine that the embedding is 2-dimensional. We have a vector associated with each word, and there's 2 elements in each vector, V0 and V1. One of the really cool things about word embeddings is that they seem to preserve the semantic structure that seems intuitive to most humans. So if you look at the cosine similarity between the word walk and run, which is theta here, that similarity is higher. The vectors tend to point in similar directions than the English word run and halt. So words that humans think are similar, like walk and run, tend to be similar in the embedding space. They also have lots of other interesting properties, but we're just going to focus on that in a moment. Can we leverage that property in training robots? And the way we did that is to take the neural network of the robot, and we added an additional neuron to the input layer, which is the green auditory neuron here. We fed in word embeddings taken from a particular embedding, which is word to vec. We took action words like walk, run, and halt, took the vectors associated with that, fed those vectors into the robot's neural network before the robot starts moving, which sets the hidden layer. Then we let the robot do its thing, and as the robot is moving in its environment, it is generating its own sensory stimulation, which is further altering the hidden layer and the motor layer and so on. So basically we whisper in the robot's ear before it moves, and then we let it move, and we subjugate populations of such robots to an evolutionary algorithm where we're trying to evolve them to be multifunctional. We have, in this cartoon example here, we'd have 3 fitness functions that measure how well the robot does at walking when it hears the embedding for walk, how well the robot does at running when the robot hears the word run, and how well the robot does at halting when it hears the word embedding associated with halt. This is a cartoon example. Obviously, the Bratenberg can't actually walk or run. But in this cartoon example, I'm trying to illustrate a particular point, which is we basically want the robot to do 2 things. We want it to obey these 3 commands: walk when asked to walk, run when asked to run, halt when asked to halt. but also preserve the semantic structure or the underlying semantic structure in the embedding space. We would like the cosine similarity between the sensor vectors, or sensor embeddings, if you like, produced by the robot when it hears these two commands to be high, in the same way that the cosine similarity is high in the embedding space. And we would also like the sensory distance, or the cosine similarity, to be low in sensor space for the robot between walk and halt and run and halt, in the same way that the cosine similarity is low between walk and halt and run and halt in the embedding space. So we're trying to do these two things in the robot. And then we're going to ask a second question, which is, if we're able to preserve this structure, it should follow that if after training we feed into the robot's neural network an embedding for a word it's never heard before, like stop, if that word is sufficiently similar in embedding space to a word it was trained on, it should be able to also produce a similar sensory signature when it moves. That's why we want to preserve this semantic structure. Okay. So obviously it turns out that this was possible. So David trained a legged robot in a physics engine to obey multiple fitness functions. The first one that you see here is forward. The fitness function was to maximize the X direction of the robot, basically walk to the right. So this robot heard the embedding associated with the word forward, and after hundreds of generations, it will actually move forward when asked to move forward. That same evolved robot, same neural network, if you feed in the word backward, it will, to some degree, move backwards, or at least move in the opposite direction. This neural network, this evolved neural network, was trained on maximize X when you hear forward and minimize X when you hear backward, and it's able to do so. It was also trained against a fitness function that rewards for stop, which is basically stay close to the origin, and it does. So you're looking at one evolved neural network that produces lack of motion when it hears stop, produces forward when it hears forward, produces backward when it hears backward. After evolution, we fed in a synonym for the word stop, which is halt, and maybe not so surprisingly, it acts appropriately. So this was the second time that a group had managed to get a robot to obey an English language word that it had never heard before. Okay, so I got 9 minutes left, so maybe a little bit of results for those that are interesting. These are the actual 4 words that we trained the robot on. So we evolved neural networks, and for each neural network we evaluated it 4 times. We fed in forward. We also fed in a misspelling of the word forward, which exists in the word Tvec corpus. We fed in the word backward and backwards. So we evaluated each neural network 4 times, and at the end of evolution, on average, across multiple evolutionary runs, the robots would move on average about 2 or 3 body lengths, forward if it was one of the 2 forward words, and backwards if it was one of the 2 backwards words. Same set of evolved neural networks. They were, when they heard stop, or suspend, they would stop. And across many replicates, we took these evolved neural networks, which had been evaluated on all 6 of these commands, had been evolved on all 6 of these commands, and they on average obeyed this command they'd never heard before, which is cease. There was no statistically significant increase in the amount of motion compared to when it had heard stop and suspend during evolution. In order to determine that we were getting robots that could obey unheard words, that we were benefiting from the embedding, we took the embeddings for these 7 words and permuted the values in the vectors. and did the whole thing again. So we evolved robots to obey forward, backward, and backwards. And for those 4, it tended to travel, again, 2 or 3 body lengths. It also successfully obeyed stop and suspend. But these robots that were receiving permuted versions of the embeddings could not handle words they had never heard before. So this was proving that indeed the robot was benefiting from the word embedding. Okay. So for some of you, this might not seem very surprising, right? Cease and stop and suspend, they're close to one another in embedding space, which means from the point of view of the neural network, we're feeding in very similar initial conditions, which you would expect would produce similar sensory trajectories as the robot moves or fails to move in response to these embeddings. Turns out that if you try this on different robots, so this is our ball bot, which actually has inside of it an active pendulum, so it can actuate the pendulum and roll itself in different directions, or this very simple scissor bot that moves along the floor. These do not obey, or it's harder to evolve neural networks that obey or retain that semantic structure. You can see that because when it works, robots stop when they hear synonyms, and they do not stop when they hear permuted synonyms. So the fact that the right-hand blue bar is much taller than the left-hand blue bar is this desired property. And you'll notice that in each of these 5 panels, which correspond to 5 different morphologies, in most of them, the right-hand blue bar is not significantly taller than the left-hand blue bar. It is in a couple of them. So what that suggests is there are morphologies in which you can simultaneously train multifunctional behavior. You can train robots to obey multiple fitness functions, and they retain the semantic structure, but it depends on choosing the right morphology. So why is that? I don't have a slide for this, but I can give you an intuition for why this is the case. As Randy and many others have explained for a long time, a robot or an autonomous agent that's interacting with its environment can be viewed as a dynamical system. You have a machine that acts, that action alters its relationship to the environment, which alters the sensory perception of the agent at the next time step, which alters, when it propagates through its neural network, alters what the robot does next. And you're repeating through this process that goes from sensors to neural network to motors to the environment, back to sensors, and around you go. If that dynamical system is linear, then it makes sense that if you have similar initial conditions, stop and cease, that linear system will unroll along similar trajectories, which are similar sensory trajectories, and it's relatively easy for evolution to obey this semantic structure. If, however, you have a robot that interacts with its environment in a nonlinear sense, then you have a nonlinear system, and nonlinear systems, if you feed them in 2 very similar initial conditions, cease and halt, there is no guarantee that those resulting sensory trajectories will stay close to one another. They will diverge, and the robot will very rapidly do very different things when it was evolved to obey cease, and after evolution hears this new command, halt. So that says that there is a Goldilocks zone here. We want to have robots that are sufficiently linear that it makes it easy for evolution to preserve the semantic structure. But if they're too linear, they're too simple, we cannot push this multifunctionality very far. If we added commands like grasp and lift, like object manipulation tasks, these robots have no arms or hands or fingers. They cannot obey those commands. We cannot find a neural network that will allow them to grab and lift objects. So we allow evolution to add arms and hands, or we feed this system a robot that has arms and hands. We now have a more embodied, a more morphologically complex robot, which, at least in theory, there probably exists a controller that will allow it to obey stop, halt, lift, grasp and lift. But because it's nonlinear, it's going to be harder to preserve the semantic structure in the embedding space and translate it into a sensory embedding. So that's what we're pursuing at the moment with this work, is getting an evolutionary algorithm to design the morphology of a robot that is just complicated enough to be able to obey all of the commands, but to do so in as linear a fashion as possible, to make it easy for evolution to or allow evolution to find neural networks for those robots that allow them to obey commands after evolution that they've never heard before. Okay, so I wanted to thank Nick and Melanie and Mike for helping to get the Proteus initiative off the ground, and thanks to Eduardo and Linda and Randy for writing support letters to get things off the ground. Sam and Doug and Mike did a lot of work on the computer-designed organisms, and David Matthews is an undergraduate who was advised by me and two other PhD students, Sam and Colin, on the word-to-vec to behavior work. Thanks to DARPA for funding computer-designed organisms, and NSF for funding the Proteus initiative. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Great. Maybe if some people want to unmute themselves, and we can give Josh for a couple of seconds. Small round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, yeah, questions. So there's, go ahead.
I was going to say, I couldn't help but notice that there were a couple questions that came up in the chat, one a little while ago and one just recently. I'm happy to read them, but Josh, if you have your chat open, you can also see them too. The first one was from Ina concerning stimulation of tissue in the Xenobots.
Yeah, so sorry, I was trying to respond to Ina's question, and she says it's already answered. Okay, there you go. So I'm sorry, I don't know how to, is it Dennis San? Is asking?
Yeah, that's right, Dennis San.
Okay. Sorry, do you want to ask your question? Maybe it's a little more engaging.
Sure, yeah. So I was just going to say, I mean, if we look at the semantic word embeddings, what they preserve is how word similarity, basically. Mm-hmm. And I was just going to ask, to what degree does that word similarity itself originate in human morphology?
The answer is I have absolutely no idea. But so in this project, we've focused on on a very small subset of the word-to-vec embedding, which are motoric words: walk, stop, run, walk, and so on. And one of the interesting things is if you look at the semantic structure in those motoric words, it tends to at least correspond intuitively with what you would think, that walk and run are actually pretty close to one another, and walk and stop. So then you can ask the question, does that have to do with human morphology? I don't know how you would test that. It's an interesting question to ask. But actually, part of the reason for starting down this path in the first place is actually to see if we can deal with a particular problem in robotics, which is perverse instantiation. So you can often evolve a robot that maximizes your fitness function, but it does so using a behavior which in retrospect is not what you wanted the robot to do. So often a robot will displace in a physics engine by exploiting the physics and blowing into 100 pieces in the physics engine. This is a big problem across robotics. So one of the things that I found interesting as an outsider about word embeddings when they got started is the fact that they seem to intuitively support what people would expect. If you give them two words from word-to-vec and you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how similar are they, that will often match what's true in the embedding. So if that's true, that people's expectations match the structure of the embedding, can we use that to better support human expectation about robot behavior? If a robot walks when it's asked to walk and then it's fed the word run, do you get what you're expecting to see? Again, that's very hand wavy, but that was the inspiration for this project in the first place.
All right, so I see a question from Rob Goldstone, then Peter Todd, and then you.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. So when you were presenting your cube at the beginning with task and embodiment, it got me thinking whether there might be like two different dimensions of embodiment, because you have like computer over on the very front edge of your cube and the real traditional robot on the far end. But it feels like you're doing two different things with the computers, and some of them seem more embodied. Like the simulations that you're doing seem like, depending on how good your virtual physics engine is, it feels rather close to the robot, much closer than Eliza or something like that. So can you comment a bit on what can be done by way of embodiment with the computer, and what it has to be done with the traditional robot?
Yeah, so great question. So following along with Rod Brooks and many others is I try and, for me at least, embodiment does not imply physicality. You can have an embodied virtual agent, and you can have a physical non-embodied agent. So yeah, throughout my career, we've worked with all sorts of physics engines, and I would argue that the simulated Xenobots, which are using a finite element soft body simulator, you can't simulate all aspects of morphology, but you can get at more of them than you could in the old days with the rigid body physics engines and the 2D cellular automata before that. But using a more complex physics engine doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do a better job of crossing the sim to real gap. That you can preserve the way in which the virtual agent exploits its embodiment into reality, because now there are many more sim to real gaps that you can trip over, right? Maybe you get the continuum mechanics right, you get the simulation of the materials right, but the friction model is off, or the light in the case of the frog cells, we're not simulating salinity and temperature and all humidity and all these other things. So so I think that's it. It's not necessarily that making a better physics engine or a more detailed physics engine is necessarily going to help you cross the sim to real gap. It is producing a more embodied virtual agent, but not necessarily one that's going to be easier to transfer to reality.
Great. So yeah, I agree with that. So it means that the computer placement, that screen that you have in this screen, it really could occupy lots of different positions on that embodiment.
It's a red herring. I should have drawn a neural network. Yeah, not a computer. Good point.
All right.
Peter, if you want to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh. A very interesting talk, both of those projects.
Thank you.
Great to hear more about the Xenobots. Like I mentioned in the chat, we have our annual award ceremony, and we have a quiz on the latest developments in cognitive science, and your work featured in our quiz last
awesome.
May. So
great to hear. Thank you. Cool.
My question though is about the second project, and I'm not sure if I got this right. Yeah, so that's perfect. What I think I thought you were going to ask is whether or not after you've trained the robot to respond to the different word embeddings, would you, and then you look at the sensory inputs that the robots are getting as they're doing those different activities, would you get the same kind of similarity structure between the sensory inputs that they're getting and the words themselves in some way? And so is that what you're doing, or did I just get excited about something else? Because it seems like that would also be an exciting finding.
It would, and the fitness functions makes it hard to answer that question, because the fitness functions are pulling in a particular direction. So actually, in this the reason I made the cartoon this way is that the magnitude of the word embedding for halt is just as large as the magnitude of the embeddings for walk and run. So you cannot, at least I don't see how, you could do a one-to-one mapping from the magnitudes of these three embeddings onto the sensory trajectories of obeying, walk, run, and halt. The magnitude of the sensory trajectory of halt should, by definition, according to the fitness function, be small. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, but of course, we can choose what sensors and motors to put on the robot. So if there is, for a certain morphology, there could be an antagonism between the semantic structure in the word embeddings and the structure in the sensory embeddings. You could try and make a clever fitness function that rewards for these three behaviors while preserving the semantic structure in the word embeddings. And or you can alter the morphology. So
Okay.
it's yeah. So this issue about alignment. So how close could you get is difficult. And again, this is a cartoon, but in general, what's the right morphology? And someone was asking a question about the relationship between word embeddings and human morphology. Naively, maybe a humanoid robot is the best choice of a body plan, because a humanoid robot can walk and run, and the sensory trajectories produced by a walking and running humanoid robot are probably more likely to preserve that semantic structure than something else.
Right.
But maybe there's something other than humanoid. And obviously, how do you lead up to a humanoid? Do you pick a subset of embeddings and train a simpler robot first and then complexify the morphology? Back to the cube, what path would you take?
Yep. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, that explains that it's a much more complicated relationship to be looking at. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, but if you want to ask your question, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I did. I also have the question about the second project.
Yep.
So the example you had were about the robot moving or not moving. What about more subtle relations, like turning left in comparison to turning right?
Yeah.
Because whatever the meaning that's captured in the vector space is like one thing is in relation to another. So moving and not moving is probably a lot easier to learn than turning right in comparison to turning left. Do you have any idea about how that works?
It's a great question. I agree with you. This is much, much easier. Move left, move right, turn left, turn right. Just those 4 phrases, trying to train a robot using the embeddings of those is a challenge. So just take like turn left. So do we feed the embedding for turn into the neural network first, then the embedding for left into the neural network, and then allow it to move? Or do we turn on the robot, allow it to move, and alternate between the embedding for turn and left, turn left, turn left? So like, how do you pose those 2 words to the robot? Do you create a higher dimensional input space where the robot can see all the elements of both embeddings for both words, turn left, at the same time? What about turn forward then turn left, or forward then left, right? The word then, that's a much more abstract word. How would you start to teach it sequentiality with embeddings? I don't know. We wanted to just make sure that it could do it with very simple individual words first. But like I said, I'm not an expert in NLP. We're just dabbling. So if people are interested in this, I would love to push this forward to richer language and see what we can do.
Yeah, I'm super interested. I'll keep in touch.
Please
Thank
do.
you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Abe, we have time for a question if you want to ask your question.
Actually, mine was really, really related to use as well, which is just, I'm curious because this seems to be really a classification problem at heart that happens to be using vectors that have to do with language. And I was curious what kind of the minimal direction towards something that necessitates kind of what we would consider linguistic capacities, such as understanding that different instructions compose with each other to form new kind of composite instructions. It sounds like maybe you're looking at things like move left, move right, turn left, turn right to go in that direction.
Yeah, I guess. So how do you see it as a classification problem? Classifying different like types of sensory trajectories, or?
As classifying these different initial inputs.
Yep.
According to their closeness in input space.
Okay. Interesting. I guess I hadn't thought about it from a classification point of view. That's interesting to think about. One other thing to think about is, again, this issue of like common words. So turn left, turn right. There's a commonality there, but what would that commonality mean in the action space? So if you have a robot that produces two different sensory trajectories for turn left, turn right, what is common among those two trajectories that differs from go straight? So I think, starting to, again, approach this issue about abstraction. There's, a modifier word that appears in multiple commands, and that produces a similar modification to each sensory trajectory. I don't know. It's just sort of off the top of my head. I think there's lots of things we could try here. Again, we would love to work with the linguist on this. Beyond stop, halt, walk, and run, what is the next most complex linguistic construct that we could tackle? Is it compositionality? Is it, greater abstraction? I don't know. One other thing I wanted to mention about this is we also connected this with the crowdsourcing project. So if you go to Twitch Plays Robotics, and I'll just type it into chat here, all one word. This is a website where we stream our evolving robots to the web, and you can watch the stream in real time, and in the chat window, you can issue commands to the robot, and they can be any English language word. As long as they're recognized by the word to vec corpus, it'll get sent to the robots. You can also type yes into chat if the robot is obeying current command, and no in chat if the robot is disobeying the command. So it's got a little bit of the reinforcement learning on top. It's interesting to look at all the commands that people have typed into chat, and we've been running this for 3 years, more or less continuously. As you can imagine, they type every swear word misspelled in every possible way. Because, of course, when you're learning a foreign language, what's the first thing that your friend teaches you? Bad words. Someone asked the robot, or they tried to teach the robot, prove Fermat's last theorem. Someone else typed in the command be interesting. But most of the commands that people type in are short, simple motoric words like walk, run, left, right, stop, halt. So people sort of spontaneously scaffold the language, or they attempt to scaffold the language learning of these machines, which in and of its own right is kind of interesting. So one of the things we're thinking about is sort of filtering out of all that crowd-generated language, the simplest things, train the robots on that, and then use the next most complex commands that the crowd thought might be groundable by the robots given what they see them doing on the stream. And this is something that Linda has obviously worked on for a long time, about how children teach parents rather than the other way around. So for those that are interested in that spin on things, I'd love to talk offline about that as well.
Josh, I have one follow-up question or a few comments.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, it seems like, and there are a few comments, but okay. It seems like combining the two works, I would imagine that one direction that you're imagining with this language stuff is to get the agents. I really like the morphology component of it, but I would imagine that you'd be looking for evolving morphologies that facilitate the learning of language, as opposed to just trying 3 fixed ones and comparing them. You want to find ways that the morphology aids the learning.
Yes.
Is that part of that direction?
Yeah. So like I showed towards the end here, we looked at these 3 different bodies: the quadruped, the ball, and the scissor. Mm-hmm. And the quadruped is better at preserving the semantic structure than the other two morphologies are, which suggests there may, it's a big may, but there may be a gradient in morphospace towards morphologies that are better able to preserve the semantic structure for a given set of fitness functions. So how would you evolve bodies to do this? What would be, could you write down a fitness function that tries to preserve, that explicitly preserves semantic structure in the embedding space?
Yes.
That's the connection between morphology and language that we'd like to pursue next.
Okay, there are a couple of comments.
Sure.
If people want to read them off or ask them, you're welcome to do so. I think Fritz, did you want to mention something, Aina, and then Derek?
Well, this is actually follows nicely here, but I feel like Derek is more to the point. Mine was simply to say at which point do memory functions play into it, like repeat functions. When would you kind of want to know, repeat last action or repeat or predicting, basically? I mean, that's higher than, of course, but those kind of things would come into it.
So that's a really good question. One of the things we noticed we actually looked at the latent embedding. So looking at the hidden layer, and for different morphologies, it ignores different parts of the embedding. So both morphologies are getting the walk embedding, but if you look at the evolved network after the fact and replay the latent space, the bodies are throwing away different things. So, if you don't have legs, maybe there's part of the word for walk or some, connotation of walk that you ignore, but if you have legs, you're paying attention to another. So it's kind of it's the opposite of what you just asked. It selectively forgets different parts of the embedding, again, depending on the body. So it'd be interesting to get to multiple words where, it forgets if you say forward then left, once it finishes forward and it's trying to turn to the left in the hidden layer, do you see it forgetting the word forward? Does it get rid of it when it doesn't need it anymore? Or like you were saying, if it needs to repeat the action. So it's particularly interesting to look at the latent spaces of these and focus on what it preserves and discards from the word embedding. I think that would be an interesting way to get at whether there's any memory here. Yeah, great question.
I just had a question about, just in answer to your question about what sort of things should be the robots be learning in terms of going left, going right, and turning, and so on. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I would probably, and I'm not a developmentalist, but that would be the question I'd be asking a developmentalist. How do little human primates who are just learning to walk, what do their caregivers tell them? How do they get around? Yeah. How do they turn left and how do they turn right? And what other things do they learn in addition to that? Because when we're all, as adults, we try to keep things simple, but we have so much experience with motion and concepts and subtle things like that. And so to me, I would just logically, I think, turn to the little tykes to see how they go about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. So Linda was telling me this morning that, and maybe I'm going to misrepresent this, that caregivers start talking to babies more or with more adult speak once they can walk. I thought that was fascinating, and you can see that on our Twitch channel, that when there's a legged robot that shows up, people say things like walk, run. When there's like a ball bot, they'll say things like roll or get to, which seems in retrospect obvious, but clearly they are trying to scaffold the robots in response to their not just their behavioral competency, but their morphology. And I think, yeah, exactly. Looking at developmental psychology could be very helpful for this project, for sure.
All right, we have one more question from Derek, and then maybe we'll start wrapping up. Derek, do you want to ask your question? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and read it. I spent some time typing it out because I've got garbage internet right now. But my question's concerning the sensory input in the latter project. It was I was curious as to why you used a single auditory neuron as opposed to multiple auditory neurons. And then as I was typing the question, it occurred to me that it could just be a matter of simplicity if you're just using a vector as input, as opposed to translating into waveform and then dealing with the dynamics of auditory processing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We did struggle with this. That it was basically a software engineering issue that the physics engine we were using for that project doesn't talk well to TensorFlow, and so you had to use a very small neural network. So what was the smallest neural network we could make would be to have just one neuron dedicated to the embedding. But as I was mentioning, that the hidden layer tends to it loses information, so you have problems with recency effect. So the front part of the vector gets lost compared to the back end, so that there is a bias in the system that the robots are better able to hear the last part of the embedding than the front part of the embedding, and that's just an artifact of the fact that we use this. So
thank you.
That's why. Yeah, but great question.
Josh, if you have time for one more question, then we'll wrap it up. So
I can
go
sit
ahead,
here
go
all
ahead.
night. It's up to you guys.
Great.
Yeah, I had one quick question. The talk was fantastic, so thank you, Josh. And so that question was kind of about the morphological constraints that you were talking about and the way in which it might be easier for the robot to learn the classification space, if you want to call it that, if it was simpler, more linear, right? So maybe when you're getting into a little bit more nonlinear area, there's constraints on the kind of classifications you can get here. So you might get for example, after you train, maybe you can get something like a heat map for the different types of actions you see when you just randomly choose a word in a different location in this space. And then if there are constraints with that morphology, you can retrain in kind of an embodied way, retrain so that you're kind of moving similar words into the right space according to what the constraints of the morphology are.
I think that's a great idea. Like I mentioned, there's this antagonism between the fitness functions, which are pulling in one direction, and the embedding, which is trying to hold on to its structure. So you could do something, maybe I think like what you're saying, which is forget the fitness function to begin with. Just match the embedding. So get it, and then gradually bring in a constraint to the morphology, which would allow it to keep the structure that it already has in sensor space while starting to obey the fitness function.
Yeah, and I mean maybe iterate it too. I'm not sure. I don't know how much constraint there actually is in the morphology if you kept on training, if it would change the way the heat map looked or something like that. But
I agree with you. Like intuitively, that feels like the right way to go, because you don't want to lose the embedding. Once you lose it, it's probably hard to get it back. So the robot should be allowed to disobey the fitness functions as long as it retains the embedding. Maybe it can't even do it in its sensor space, but as long as it does it in the latent space, in the hidden layer, and then actualize it in the embodiment. Start to act out with sensory trajectories that structure.
I don't know. It's very interesting to me.
But like you said, I think there's lots of different ways we could try and attack this, and I'd be open to collaborating on that.
All right. Yes, great talk. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us, for visiting IU virtually. Sorry we couldn't give you a GoPro tour.
Next time.
If we could take a second, maybe if people could unmute themselves for one last round of applause for Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my afternoon here and meeting some new faces. And thanks for your time and your interest. And I hope to follow up with some of you offline.
Hey.
Thanks again. Have a good evening. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Josh.